All right, diving in. Today we're taking a deep dive into the world of autism in adults. We're looking at this website, Cheap ADA, specifically their page on recognizing the signs in adults.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area because it's something that, we're learning more about all the time. And it's not just about kids, right? It's about how autism shows up across the lifespan.
Totally. It's like we're uncovering this whole other layer of human experience that's always been there.
Hmm.
But before we even get into the signs and all that, can you break down what autism spectrum disorder, ASD, what does that even mean? Because Cheap ABA uses that term a lot.
Yeah, for sure. So ASD is basically a neurodevelopmental condition. It affects how people communicate, how they interact with others, and how they kind of experience the world around them. And you'll notice that word spectrum. It's important.
Yeah, I was going to say it's not like a one-size-fits-all thing,
Yeah.
right?
Not at all. It's not like a yes or no. Think of it more like a gradient, like with colors. Some people might experience autism really subtly, while for others, it presents some really significant challenges. It's all about recognizing that diversity within that spectrum.
And Cheap ABA seems especially interested in adults who might have gone through their whole lives without ever getting a diagnosis.
Exactly. They really stress looking at the signs, not the stereotypes, especially since more adults are seeking diagnosis later in life.
So let's get into those signs. Cheap ABA kind of categorizes them, and they start with social challenges. What do those look like in adults?
Well, think about things like social cues, those little nuances. Someone on the spectrum might misunderstand sarcasm or just find it hard to keep up with a casual conversation.
Yeah.
Or maybe they prefer smaller groups, or just feel really drained by huge social gatherings.
Yeah, I can see how those situations could feel super overwhelming, especially if you don't realize there's a reason behind it. Cheap ABA also mentions stuff about eye contact and facial expressions being tough.
Right. And it's so important to understand that it's not about being disinterested. The autistic brain just processes social info differently, like eye contact, something most people don't even think about that can feel really intense, really distracting for someone on the spectrum.
Like their sensory system is wired a little differently, leading to those differences in how they interact, right? Speaking of sensory stuff, Cheap ADA also lists sensory sensitivities as a possible sign.
Oh, yeah, that one's huge. Imagine being bombarded by the hum of fluorescent lights that most people barely notice, or maybe a certain fabric just feels unbearable. These sensitivities, whether it's being overly sensitive or even undersensitive, it can be a constant source of stress. Everyday environments can be overwhelming.
It's not just a preference thing, it's about how deeply those sensations can impact someone's comfort, their well-being. It reminds me of when Cheap ABA talks about repetitive behaviors and this thing called stimming.
Yeah, so stimming is short for self-stimulating behaviors. It's things like rocking back and forth, flapping your hands, or even repeating certain words or phrases.
Stuff that might seem a little out of the ordinary to someone who doesn't experience the world in the same way.
Exactly. And it's important to remember these behaviors aren't meant to be disruptive. They actually serve a purpose.
So it's like a way of coping, self-regulating, when things get overwhelming or anxiety-inducing.
Exactly. Stimming can be a really important tool for managing all that sensory input, finding a bit of calm or focus.
Then Cheap ADA gets into executive function challenges, which honestly I think everyone can relate to sometimes, but I'm guessing it's different in this context.
Oh, absolutely. So executive function, that's like your brain's management system, planning, organizing, making decisions. For someone with autism, those functions might not work as smoothly, which can make everyday tasks really difficult.
Like juggling deadlines at work, or even dealing with a sudden change of plans.
Exactly. Now, amplify that feeling of being overwhelmed, and you start to get a sense of the challenges someone with executive function differences might be dealing with daily. And this ties in directly with another sign, Cheap ABA points out, emotional regulation issues.
Makes sense. Those two would go hand in hand. If your brain's always working overtime, regulating emotions is probably way harder.
Right. Think of it like a dimmer switch for your feelings. For some autistic adults, that dimmer switch, it doesn't always work, right? They might have trouble recognizing their own emotions, expressing them. This can lead to what others might see as an inappropriate reaction or overly intense.
So a meltdown, for example, isn't necessarily defiance. It's more likely that the person is just overwhelmed and they don't have the tools to handle those emotions at that moment.
Exactly. It's a communication of distress, not manipulation.
Cheap ABA wraps up their list with unique interests, which honestly doesn't sound bad on the surface.
Mm.
How does this become a potential sign of autism?
You're right, having passions is great. But for someone on the spectrum, those interests, they can become all-consuming, often at the expense of other things in life.
So it's about the intensity and how it impacts other areas of their life.
Exactly. Imagine spending hours upon hours on one specific topic to the point that, social interactions or daily tasks just fall by the wayside. It becomes a balancing act.
It sounds like cheap ABA is really trying to show the nuances of autism in adults, how it's not always obvious or easy to spot.
And it's so important to remember that this list, it's just a starting point.
Definitely not a self-diagnosis checklist.
Right. Everyone's experience with autism is unique. There's no single autism look or behavior.
So if someone's listening to us right now and they're starting to see parts of themselves in these signs, what would you say is the most important takeaway?
If something clicks, if something resonates, the most crucial step is to talk to a qualified professional. Self-diagnosis can be tempting, but it just doesn't carry the weight of someone who can really assess the situation properly.
And finding the right professional is key, right? Someone who truly understands the ins and outs of autism in adults.
Absolutely. And you know what? We'll dig deeper into that whole process after a quick break. Finding the right person is key. Yeah. Someone who really gets adult autism, not just how it presents in kids.
Right, because adults seeking a diagnosis, they've got years of experiences, observations, maybe even some misinterpretations they've made along the way. It's not as simple as checking off boxes on a list.
No, not at all. It's more about like putting a story together. So someone listening out there might be thinking, this sounds kind of familiar. And that's often the first hurdle, just admitting that maybe those feelings of being different, maybe it's autism.
Like a light bulb moment,
Yeah.
right? Like, oh, there might be something to this. But then how do you even start the process of getting evaluated?
Well, once you've kind of had that realization, the next step is to find a professional. You'll want someone who specifically specializes in diagnosing autism in adults.
Okay, so not just any therapist, but someone who really knows this specific area.
Exactly. You want to look for a psychologist, psychiatrist, or neuropsychologist, someone with that specialized knowledge, because adults face unique challenges, years of maybe masking their traits or even internalizing those misconceptions about autism that are out there.
So you found your expert. What's next? What should someone expect when they go through an evaluation? Is it just like one appointment, or is it more involved?
Oh, it's definitely a journey, not a quick trip. The evaluation, it usually takes a few appointments. They really want to get a complete picture. It usually starts with a really deep dive into your personal history.
Like putting all the pieces of puzzle together, right?
Yeah.
Looking for those patterns that maybe weren't obvious before.
Yeah, exactly. They'll ask about your childhood, social interactions, any challenges you faced throughout your life. And then to understand how your brain works, they might use standardized tests, questionnaires, things like that.
So it's less about the what of the signs and more about the why behind them.
Exactly. They're trying to figure out your unique way of experiencing the world.
And I imagine being open and honest with a clinician throughout that process is key.
Absolutely. That relationship, that trust, it's huge. The more you share about your experiences, worries, even your hopes for the future, the better they can understand you and provide a truly accurate assessment.
It's about being your own advocate in that self-discovery. Now, we've talked about recognizing the signs, but cheap ABA doesn't really go into why someone might seek a diagnosis later in life. I mean, if you've managed this long, why go through it?
It's different for everyone, really personal. For some people, it's about finally having an explanation for feeling different, Like, oh, so that's why I struggle with that particular thing.
Yeah, it could be like a huge relief just having that awareness.
Right. It can really boost self-acceptance. It's not about changing who you are, but about understanding the why behind certain behaviors.
And having that understanding can then open doors to support and resources that someone might not have even known about before.
Absolutely. A diagnosis can be what you need to get accommodations at work, in school. It can connect you with therapists who specialize in autism in adults, people who can help you learn coping mechanisms for sensory overload, build social skills, you name it.
It's like leveling the playing field a bit.
Exactly. And for a lot of people, it goes beyond just understanding themselves. It's also about community, finding other people who get it.
Finding your people, your tribe. There's something powerful about that.
Yeah, incredibly validating. And it's important to remember getting a diagnosis isn't about labeling yourself or limiting yourself.
It's about understanding your own unique neurodiversity and using that knowledge to live your best life. Really is like taking control of your own story. But, cheap ABA, they focus so much on spotting the signs, they kind of skip over what support looks like after a diagnosis. What happens next? What helps adults who are just coming to terms with this new understanding of themselves?
That's a really important piece that they don't really get into. It's true, right? It's not like you get a diagnosis and boom, that's it, you're done. It's about figuring out what support you need, and that looks different for everyone.
So no easy answers, no one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. But there are some things that tend to help a lot of people, like therapy. That can be huge. And I don't mean just any therapist. It's got to be someone who really understands autism in adults.
Finding that specialist, it seems like that's a recurring theme. Someone who gets the unique challenges.
Absolutely. You need someone who understands what it means to maybe have masked your true self for years, felt misunderstood, tried to fit into a world that wasn't built for you. Therapy can be a place to, explore coping strategies for sensory overload, maybe work on social skills, even address things like anxiety or depression, which, let's face it, can come along with the territory.
Right, it's not just about the autism itself. It's about how those experiences, they affect mental health over time.
Exactly. Years of feeling out of sync, it takes a toll. Therapy can help unpack that, give you healthier ways to cope.
It's like giving yourself permission to say, this was hard and I deserve support.
Exactly. And that's where support groups come in, too. Cheap ABA, mention of the autism community. But connecting with other autistic adults, whether it's online or in person, it's more than just, hey, we have this in common.
It's about that sense of belonging, like you said earlier, finding your tribe.
Exactly. It's a place to share tips, advice, resources, even just celebrate being who you are without judgment. It's a reminder that you're not alone in this.
We talked about therapy, support groups, but what about like practical support? If someone gets a diagnosis, how can that help them advocate for themselves at work, at school?
That's where accommodations come in. Having that diagnosis, it's like having official recognition of your needs.
Yeah.
Makes it easier to ask for things that can make a real difference.
So for instance, if someone's really sensitive to noise, like we talked about before, they could ask for a quieter workspace, maybe even use noise-canceling headphones.
Exactly. Or if executive function is a struggle, maybe they need flexible deadlines, help with organization, visual aids, whatever it takes.
It's about making your environment work for you, not against you.
Exactly. And it's important to remember accommodations are not about special treatment. They're about creating a level playing field. Making sure everyone has the chance to succeed, neurodiversity or not.
This deep dive has been eye-opening, really. We've covered so much, the signs of autism in adults, why diagnosis matters, building that support network. As we wrap up, what are like the big takeaways you hope people walk away with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that autism, it's not one thing. There are so many ways it can look, and those ways don't always match those stereotypes we have. It's about recognizing that every autistic person is different, has their own unique experience.
Seeing the person, not the label.
Exactly.
Huh.
And to anyone listening who related to what we talked about today, remember, reaching out for professional help, it's not weakness, it's strength. Knowledge is power. Understanding how your brain works, that can change everything.
It's about building a life that works for you, on your terms.
Absolutely. And you don't have to do it alone. There's support out there, communities, resources. You can thrive.
And that wraps up our deep dive into the world of autism in adults. If this got you thinking, head over to Cheap ABA, check out their resources, and look for other organizations that support neurodiversity. Remember, understanding starts with knowledge, and it can lead to a more accepting, more empowered world.